Welcome back to another episode of Diving Deep. I'm your host, Kirsten O'Brien, and this is episode 2 of the series on climate change. Specifically, this series will answer the question, will the effects of man-made climate change affect the world similarly to the climate fluctuations during the Little Ice Age in the 1400s? Today's episode will take you through the scientific methods used to retrieve climate change data, look into the numbers of climate change deniers despite the evidence, and talk about the international climate goals created by the UN and the pushback from countries on lowering their fossil fuel emissions. Climate scientists have been trying to determine the climate change that has already occurred and is yet to come. But to do so, we need to gather more information from previous periods where scientific data determining the daily temperature and yearly fluctuations were not readily available. This is where proxy data comes in. Thought bubble time. Proxy data is a way to substitute data that we do not have with things that we already do. An article called Archives of Nature and Archives of Society by Stefan Bronneman, Christian Pfizer, and Sam White looks at the difference between paleoclimatology and historical climatology, giving readers a better understanding of how data is collected in climate change research. Both paleoclimatology and historical climatology share a common goal of reconstructing climates before the regular instructional records existed. However, the method of reconstructing data is different. Paleoclimatologists reconstruct the past from physical traces in the cryosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and lithosphere. The evidence comes from various proxies such as ice, tree ring samples, and growth or lack thereof. Also pollen samples, oxygen isotope ratios, and sulfate and lead concentrations within the Earth. These are measurable methods of data collection that paleoclimatologists use to piece together what the climate was like in the past. Alternatively, historical climatologists look at historical records, such as first-hand counts and annals from people who experienced and recorded the weather firsthand. So let's put this into perspective a little bit more. My first secondary source dives into this 5-year period of extreme weather across Europe. But in this example, we'll focus specifically on Italy. Historical climatology is evident through a variety of first-hand accounts and annals. Specifically, the journal of a Russian bishop is used. He talks about his travels through Spain in 1474 and the double harvest that occurred, which is tied back to phenological research performed by paleoclimatologists studying the advantages of certain phenologies of grapes during this time period. The grapes that were able to thrive and yield a double harvest contained phenologies known to be successful under drought and extremely hot conditions. Both methods of data extraction allowed for us to reconstruct that Italy was dry and hot during this time period. After hearing about some of the methods to reconstruct climates from the past, which gives us a bigger picture of how climate change is occurring today, it's hard to believe that there's still a large population globally that denies climate change to be an issue, but surely they exist. This graph shows the percentage of people who think climate change is a big, minor threat, or not an issue at all, by country. Now, areas of interest here are the big producers of carbon emissions, such as the US, Canada, and Russia. One more thing to point out is that major oil-producing countries such as Nigeria are also very low on this list. As the biggest contributors, having a fair amount of people that do not see climate change as an issue is alarming, and will factor into the changes that we make at the federal and provincial levels to limit fossil fuel emissions. So now let's take a look at our own country and notice on the graph here provided how climate change and voting affect each other. As you can see above, this graph looks at if climate change is the biggest issue and who votes for it. Essentially, you're more likely to vote Liberal or NDP if climate change is your top issue, and Conservatives are more likely to vote on issues based on taxes or improving healthcare. A major theory as to why climate change will not be the main issue is because only 6% of Conservatives care about climate change as their top issue, and they make up 33% of the total voter population. There's no doubt that climate change will not be the main issue to be resolved in Canada. Politically speaking, if a Liberal leader, as Prime Minister, such as Trudeau, is in power, there's still going to be a minority government, meaning a mixture of Conservatives and Liberals, as well as the other parties, need to agree on an issue before a bill is passed. This makes it very hard to pass a bill that costs taxpayers money, but will help the planet globally, since the conservatives and liberals do not often agree on climate change. There's also another debate as to why there's such pushback on lowering fossil fuel emissions at the international level. Years ago, there was a UN agreement to limit fossil fuel use, and many countries, such as Canada, backed out within the last 20 years. The top producers of fossil fuel emissions, such as Canada, the US, Iran, and Russia, argued that they could not decrease production because it would negatively impact the economy. They say the responsibility should fall on the developing countries increasing their non-renewable energy use. And the developing countries, specifically Brazil, China, and India, argued that the fault should not be left to them to carry the burden, which would prevent their rise on the world stage. So in 2015, the UN met in Paris, bringing together almost 200 governments, and most of them agreed towards limiting global temperature increases to under 2 degrees Celsius, to generate a funding mechanism for poorer countries to mitigate against the threats they face from climate change, and, third, to fund research and development costs for alternative energy sources. The agreement in Paris was a way to make steps forward while listening to the big powers, so to decrease in emissions would not dramatically affect the economy and allow the developing countries to still invest resources into their emerging industries. This final image to look at is a map of the world. The greener area will be less affected by climate change, and the closer the color is to red, the more affected the area will be by extreme weather. As you can see, Canada, the US, Russia, China, Australia, and a lot of Western Europe remain in this green section, which suggests that the implications of the changing climate will not be as significant as compared to the whole continent of Africa and South America. And we know this. We justify the actions because the UN has set aside money to help these areas that will be affected more. Essentially, they will be supplied resources to survive instead of fixing the issue at its core with the mass use of fossil fuels still prominent in the world today. In this episode, we discuss some common methods by climate scientists to reconstruct the past and predict the future of climate change. We briefly discussed the climate deniers, as well as the big three, US, Russia, and Canada, as well as Nigeria and Iran as the world producers of oil, followed by a breakdown of the Canadian population and the statistics of people who voted based on climate change as a main argument. Next, I suggested 2 theories explaining why climate change interventions are not the top priority, first at the national level in Canada, and second at the universal level. Finally, we show real data of the regions of the world that will be affected most by climate change, and we notice that the countries being affected have little to do with the man-made climate change on a global scale. Next time on Deep Dive, we'll look at what the scientists are actually saying about climate change. Then we will dive into my own research on a period in the Little Ice Age that caused extreme fluctuations across all of Europe in the 1400s. Finally, I will leave you with the answer to the question: if the climate change we are going to experience will resemble the conditions seen in the 1400s caused by the Little Ice Age.